Hey, here's something a little different. In the context of the Trump-Russia investigation and the indictments that we've been seeing and talk of impeachment, resignation, maybe someday criminal charges against Donald Trump, there's a question that's come up now a handful of times from people in the email and in comments online, which is, what about an insanity defense? Is it possible that Donald Trump, if he were at some point to be indicted or charged for who knows what, and we're thinking ahead quite a bit here, could he maybe get away with an insanity defense? And why would people even be asking about that, right? Maybe part of it is that we've talked about Donald Trump showing some signs, maybe early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's, which of course aren't mental illness. They're disorders of the brain, but certainly they affect mental health and sort of whether you are cognitively able to carry out a job. But let's think through it a little bit because I think it's an interesting question. The first thing to know and to be aware of is that at the top level, insanity defenses, number one, are really rare. And number two, even when used, they tend not to work. Okay. Similarly to how we hear a lot about terrorist attacks and people think that they're more likely than in reality, we hear stories about insanity defenses. But the truth is that, at least according to one study I looked at, number one, under 1% of all cases even attempt an insanity defense. And when it's used, it works, meaning, it leads to a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, only about 1 out of 4 times, right? Roughly 25% of the time. When the insanity defense does work, meaning under 1% of cases attempt it, of those, only 25% successfully use it. 90% of that 25% of that 1%, okay, so we're talking about, small number here, 90% of that time, the individual who successfully uses the defense had been diagnosed formally with a mental illness before the alleged acts that they have been accused for and the trial in question, right? And part of this has to do with burden of proof. Interesting that this has to do with an assassination attempt against the president, but after Ronald Reagan's attempted assassin was found not guilty by reason of insanity, the burden of proof in an insanity defense shifted to the defense. That's very significant. Normally, in the American justice system, the prosecution has to prove their case before a judge or jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And the defense merely needs to create or point out reasonable doubt in order to, as the law is written, obtain an acquittal, a not guilty verdict. When you put forward an insanity defense, it is the defense attorneys who have to prove with clear and convincing evidence that the person they are defending, that the defendant, is insane, and that insanity exculpates them having committed the crime, legally speaking. And that is really, really tough. The other aspect for this, which is difficult with Trump, or not difficult, but doesn't really align with what we know about him, is that part of the basis for being legally insane relates to being unable to distinguish right from wrong. I don't believe that Donald Trump is unable to distinguish right from wrong. I think Trump knows right from wrong, but his delusional megalomaniac personality makes him think that he's untouchable, right? That he can get away with these things that he probably to some extent realizes aren't okay things to be doing. And that is sort of the opposite of an insanity defense. That is actually something that would be considered an aggravating factor, sort of a total disregard for the rightness or wrongness of action. So really, for a possible successful insanity defense for Trump, and again, this is if at some point it came up, and we have no idea that it ever will, it would probably be only if we had some kind of actual diagnosis that would prove Trump had diminished capacity for understanding the real world, which for Trump really would be dementia or Alzheimer's. Long story short, I think we shouldn't be counting on it. And quite frankly, I think we shouldn't even really be thinking about it. Let's let the investigations happen as they should, as Robert Mueller is carrying them out. And then we'll deal with the consequences if and when we know them. And in the meantime, let's try to keep winning some elections like Democrats were able to do on Tuesday this week.